Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to offer some tips and guidelines for interpreting this Mars-Pluto opposition in your natal chart. So let's just take a look here. On November 3rd, they will in exact opposition at 29 degrees 45 minutes Capricorn Cancer. At the time of this video, they're about 2 degrees away from each other. So it's going to take a whole week for Mars to cover those 2 degrees. This is a very intense energy. Let's just appreciate Mars is slowing down, getting ready for this retrograde journey. So whenever a planet is slowing down, there's an intensification of focus. So when we think about this Mars in your natal chart, where it's transiting, we should appreciate, besides for the fact of it being in opposition to Pluto, which we'll talk about, there is a very deep introspective quality. We are reworking and analyzing, kind of getting underneath and introspecting rather, at what is the core of how we're choosing to respond and make choices to the content of our life right now. Mars in that phase of slowing down becomes very internal. Of course, it can also be very visceral. We can feel very triggered. But the underlying evolutionary intention is there's something that's being reworked right now, and it's helpful to appreciate that that archetype is very much at play right now. Being that this is the first of 3 oppositions, and that it's the only one that will happen in the Cancer-Capricorn axis at the very end of this axis, just before Mars goes retrograde, further add to this deeply introspective, contemplative, culminative quality to this opposition. I think it's helpful to say, to introduce what I'll speak about today, that however this is landing in your own natal chart, for all of us collectively and individually, there's a sense of something essential is coming up right now. Something essential is wanting to be integrated and understood. It's very much at the edge of your seat. Where are we going to go with this kind of vibe, okay? So appreciating this is an evolutionary transition. I made a couple of videos just speaking to the psychological nature of this transit. I'll be sure to post those. We can really have some compassion and patience for how deep this actually is. Where things feel unclear, where things feel stuck, can really be just held in a space of, okay, this is a part of the process here. We're here to evolve. We're going somewhere we haven't yet been. Okay, so what I'll soon do is offer a bunch of tips for working with this in your own natal chart. I'm actually going to make a Pluto Mars transit through the houses video very soon. I'll be posting that within a day of posting this video. But this is a helpful prelude because I want everyone to feel empowered to kind of contemplate, all right, we're dealing with Mars, we're dealing with Pluto. How do you work with these energies together and to actually bring it together in your own natal chart? So I'll also be speaking to what does it mean in general for Mars and Pluto to be in opposition to each other? How do we understand that personally in transit? Okay, so before I jump into that, a couple announcements. I often will write articles in tandem to these video teachings. I actually wrote an article highlighting this Mars-Pluto opposition through the 12 house polarities. It's a very long article. So if you want to receive that and all future teachings, you can subscribe to my newsletter below. I also have an archive on my newsletter page where you can access all past recordings. And I want to make sure everyone knows about my upcoming class series. I'm going to be teaching a series on planets that square the lunar nodes. This is based in the technique and the teachings of Jeffrey Wolf Green. When a planet squares the lunar nodes in astrology, both in transit and in natal charts, speaks to a very essential core karmic dynamic that wants to be integrated and resolved. And until that happens, there's a flip-flopping between both nodal polarities. So working with this, especially in natal charts, is an incredibly helpful and rich interpretive technique and wisdom teaching for applying something that is actually pretty common. Many of us have at least one planet or a point in the chart squaring the lunar nodes. So we'll learn about the meaning of this square dynamic. Each series, each class will be focused on a different planet in its square to the nodes. How to identify the specific karmic issues, how to work out its resolution. We'll work with a variety of combinations of nodal ruler situations, like when the nodal rulers are conjunct or opposite each other, or when you have a stellium of planets squaring the nodes, or 2 planets opposite each other, both squaring the nodes. As we continue to work with various charts and bring forward these teachings, we'll be able to encounter a diversity of learning examples. This class begins in just over a week. I taught a free intro class a week or so ago, and this is a requisite. So if you want to join this class series, you have to watch this intro class. It was a very in-depth intro class. I highly recommend it. And you can access it for free, and I'll put a link in the description below. As always, I'm available for one-on-one sessions for individuals, couples, and discounted long-term soul-to-soul companionship sessions for those that want to work with me more long-term. All right, let's jump into today's topic. Let me first introduce the archetype of opposition polarity, when you have two planets opposite each other. Adam Gainsbourg, one of my first teachers, described this brilliantly. He described an opposition as a backwards-facing conjunction. Why is that meaningful? Well, when we have a conjunction, the intention, the underlying archetype is to unify. There's a new cycle beginning, a new process relative to those two particular planetary functions. When we're in opposition, the challenge is we tend to be bound by these perceived opposites, right? The stress of an opposition between any two planets is this tension between here's one facet of life, and then this is in confrontation to another facet of life. We can feel tugged in our social experience, in our outward relational experience relative to what we're trying to work out within ourselves. And the teaching isn't to find some kind of balance between the extremes, but a complete integration that transcends the duality of being divided in the first place, right? Like the teaching of the opposition is to bring a unification of where we might be bound or stuck in these dualities. It's a helpful way to think about it, because otherwise polarities are often going to feel like a tension of irreconcilable opposites or irreconcilable needs, things like that. So when we contemplate this with Mars and Pluto, obviously that's going to be intense. Pluto corresponding to underlying desire, deeper subconscious psychological content, the sort of imperative motive that brings us into this life and what we're working out as a soul. And Mars is will, desire, consciously what we're choosing, where we're directing our life moment to moment, and where we're instigated. So what I'm going to do here is take us through several steps of interpretation. We can contemplate each one of these for our own natal chart. And we're going to do it step by step. So we're going to start with Mars, right? Think about Mars, where it's transiting in Cancer, what house it's in, as corresponding simply to activity. Mars means activity. What does that mean? Things are happening. Either this activity is manifesting in the external, right? People, places, events, things that are stimulating experience, or we're being internally stimulated relative to feelings, desires, or impressions that are happening in our life. One way or another, something is moving. And thus, where there is activity, it's always going to impel some kind of response, right? So whatever is happening, wherever the stimulating content is arising, we become mindful of how are we perceiving it and how are we choosing to respond to it. If we feel that our essential safety is being triggered, we might act from a very reactive and triggered place. So there's a calling for some level of self-awareness and mindfulness relative to whatever's arising for us. It can be very easy with a Mars transit like this to be very protective and defensive and to act as if we are under threat. In fact, Mars in Cancer can feel like a mother protecting her young on the premise of seeing a very real threat, right? And our most defensive, harsh, protective qualities can come out. Relative to the tender places within us, behavior can actually become very visceral and reactive and not necessarily take us where we're wanting to go if we're just being reactive to our impressions. Okay, so now we go into look towards the evolutionary intent. See where Pluto is to indicate where on a fundamental level the purpose is to evolve into our greater soul potential of strength and resiliency. Pluto here is pointing to our potential to stabilize even more in our agency, wisdom, and the strength that is within the soul itself. So you can contemplate this house position of Pluto as an absolute statement of truth. So where's Pluto moving? This is pointing to where we're evolving and accessing a greater dimension of strength and resiliency fundamentally. Okay, that's one level of Pluto. So holding these pieces in mind, right? Mars is activity and our response to that activity. Pluto is where we're learning this greater strength of our soul, and that's where we haven't yet evolved into it. And thus, we're going to go to the next piece, which is Pluto is also going to, in part, mean resistance to evolution, right? This same house transit of Pluto points to our very resistance, where we do not yet know the depth of our own power. And thus, this is where we can feel ourselves stuck, entangled in conditions beyond our control, and not in touch with our agency of choice. Right? The psychology of entrapment and entanglement is a big part of the Pluto dynamic. This is where we thus might feel a very deep loss of power in our lives. So you kind of feel where I'm going with this. Mars is reactivity, right, relative to content arising. Pluto, while it is about our leadership to make conscious choices, can be about our reactivity. Pluto, while it is about evolution towards our deeper soul agency, can also be fundamentally where we don't know ourselves to be free and don't know our agency and are psychologically entangled in unconscious content that we don't know how to get out of, right? So imagine what happens when you combine the two. So Mars will trigger and push the buttons of the evolutionary intent potential of Pluto. And this is what polarity does. The activity that's being instigated here relative to Mars is ultimately serving to push us into our evolution. It's helpful to contemplate, how is this experience, this event, this challenge, this perception helping me to evolve? And remember that evolution means becoming that which we have not yet realized ourselves to be, right? So it's a real inner change. What we're changing is not external event, or we're changing ourselves. There's a fundamental shift happening on the internal level of the soul itself. This means we will never quite understand what we are becoming until we've become it. Thus, we need to have a soul-focused attitude and be determined not to get sucked down by the temptation to stay in our sense of littleness. Right? This means life is actually pushing us through the sense of being pushed and triggered into our greatness, the grandeur of our soul being. So let's spend more time on analyzing this idea. Think about the unconscious dynamics of Pluto, where we think we're stuck, we think we're trapped, we think we're entangled, we don't know our own power, right? In evolutionary astrology, there's a lot of teaching on the polarity point of Pluto. So take Mars out of the picture for a moment. And you can think of your own natal chart too. It's a helpful practice, right? Transiting Pluto, the point opposite Pluto is actually going to represent a point of high stress and trigger relative to where we're going to hold on to our greatest unconscious security patterns. Because Pluto is where we're going to resist change. Pluto is where we're afraid of letting go. Pluto is where we don't know how to source our own internal power. So relative to that, the opposition point says, if you can integrate that polarity, you're going to be able to face your deepest points of resistance. Let's just contemplate that in general. Pluto and Capricorn as an archetype. What is the deepest fear, right? We can become psychologically entangled and stuck in the structural realities, in the agreement, in the roles that are defining us. I mean, the roles of our life are defining us, and we are enslaved to a structure or to an authority or to a power outside of ourselves that we cannot control. This can include patterns or things that have a hold of our own life force that are dominating us. We can be overly identified by who we're supposed to be, or the roles, or the meeting the expectations of the world, and lose a touch with our own soul. The pressures, the demands, being overly concerned with being judged or how we're being perceived, needing external approval, these are all points of deep psychological enmeshment and entanglement. What's the Cancer polarity represent here? What does that teach? Well, think about, what are you not going to do when you're stuck in the addiction of Pluto and Capricorn? Take the story of someone that is so consumed with making sure they do everything right, that their projection of their father, mother figure, their boss, how they put it on their relationships, how they put it on everyone around them in their life, and their children, their family, their parents, is always reflecting back to them. Am I okay? Am I good? Am I acceptable? Am I approved of? So this soul will get into all kinds of relational experiences in life to work out where their power is being sourced in that external approval and validation. If they're entangled and stuck in that, they're not going to be accessing their emotional body. They're not going to be connecting to, how do I feel? I'm doing these things, I'm making these agreements, I'm working really hard, or I'm holding these harsh judgments, or I'm allowing myself to be identified with these forms of control. But how do I feel? Am I being nourished? Do I feel connected to my soul on the inside? Am I discharging my emotion? Do I feel worthy and safe enough to actually connect with the underlying core of my inner being? If we're in these roles of responsibility and we're overly focused on what we're supposed to do, we might lose touch with the heart of why we're doing it in the first place. And there are many other examples that I can give, but hopefully that demonstrates in general how that Cancer polarity is just like a stress to that Capricorn. No, I'm not going to go and sit and feel my feelings. No, I'm not going to focus on what's going on. I'm not going to take some therapy. I'm not going to unravel because I'm needing to be this. I'm needing life to be this. I'm needing things to be this way. And so we might miss out on the inner world, Cancer. So we can say, relative to Pluto and Capricorn, that Cancer polarity, that opposition point, the Pluto polarity point in Cancer, becomes a point of integration. We can say the evolutionary learning, the growth for this soul, for all of us collectively, and you can imagine this in a natal chart too, is to concentrate on the fundamental state of inner security. Come home to your soul right here and right now, regardless of the comings and the goings of social approval, acceptance, or the judgments or the identifications you have with who you are and what you're supposed to be. Can you feel how that's a powerful statement of evolution? That Cancer polarity point. My soul, I am at home in my soul right now. Or my soul is my home right now. Right? It's a coming home to oneself, which takes us away from whatever Capricornian entanglement. So now, move Mars in Cancer, that polarity point, that point which is otherwise a very important integration point for evolution, is met with an actual planet. And this is why we can really understand and appreciate that Mars, via all of the Cancer stimulation, am I safe? Am I loved? Am I wanted? Is it okay? Am I being threatened? Is pushing up against the structured roles, the conditioning, and the entanglements and the entrapments that are so defining and restrictive of our soul and our agency of Pluto and Capricorn. So it's helpful to contemplate and just take some time to breathe that in. How is this Mars in Cancer transit triggering the deepest subconscious and fear patterns of this natal Pluto? And thus, how is it instigating our own evolution? Relative to polarity, this Mars-Pluto opposition is going to bring up a high level of stress. We're going to feel threatened and challenged or pushed in some essential way. And relative to where we don't know our agency, we won't know how to meet that. It's going to feel for many of us, like a rock in a hard place, okay? So it's just helpful to work that out. The answer to that rock in the hard place is evolution. The answer is you don't know who you are. The answer is there's a solution to all of this beyond the threshold of what you have yet to realize and understand. Okay, the next piece here is in the face of temptation, we strengthen our desire for truth. So in virtue of this Mars position poking at what is most vulnerable and unrealized within, we appreciate that if we are tempted to act or behave in certain harmful or destructive ways, it must mean that there's another way, and that we have not yet understood this other way. Can we get that? Just if there's a temptation to act from fear, from victimization, from I'm unstuck or I am being attacked, there's something fundamentally taking my freedom away, it must mean there is another way that we have not yet understood. If we are quiet, this can become a point of gratitude, perhaps, just in the recognition of there is in fact a path of true empowerment available in this very place that we are currently perceiving ourselves to be not in that empowerment. A moment that we see as totally contrary to a state of security and empowerment. See life as inviting us to learn, like a training ground that is intentionally pushing us to grow up. It is not actually here to hurt you, if we can only understand this. This is a way to work with that polarity. Whatever deeper psychological subconscious content, this is don't give in to the temptation of identifying with our perceptions and with our impressions. And if someone asked me this YouTube comment and challenged me to make a video on this, I ended up writing an article. It's a blog. If you want to see the blog, I'll post it in my description, but it's not really an astrology article, so I didn't know where to put it. But the question was, like, what if you're being pushed or triggered by people that are actually being intentionally hurtful and deceitful or manipulative? And I think that's a really good question. And I want to give a moment for it because this happened, right? Like, there's something spiritual about pretending that people sometimes don't try to do hurtful things. And I think about Jesus on the cross. He wasn't like, God, forgive them because I think they're trying to kill me, but really they're not. You know, he's like, no, they're trying to kill me. They're trying to crucify me. But what he said was, forgive them for they know not what they do. And I think that's really beautiful. I don't really think this was really, in my interpretation, a matter of Jesus speaking to God. I think it was him working with his own mind. Let me not see them and identify them in their ego. I think a lot of times life is just this opportunity for us in our relationships, or this opportunity for us to recognize the beautiful teaching in A Course in Miracles. There's either a love or a calling for love. And all fear, if properly interpreted, is a calling for love. And if we interpret fear as a reason for attack or defense, we're making a statement to who we are. But if we interpret as a call for love, we're making a statement that we are that love. We affirm the fact of our resiliency and strength in actually choosing to see the calling for love from our brothers and from our sisters that are just in their ignorance, just like we are often in our ignorance. We remain in our ignorance in our refusal to step up into our greater strength as love. This is a threshold that, of course, we're all working on, right? It's not an easy path. This is what evolution is about. And so we're going to have really strong perceptions. And I think it's not useful to spiritually bypass and ignore sort of the egoic level. And I think the teaching here in not identifying with those perceptions of I am being hurt or attacked or manipulated is not to ignore that obviously someone's doing something harmful, and oftentimes very intentionally so. This happens all the time. But where do I want to direct my mind? What story do I want to create? Taking responsibility for our perceptions is really more a matter of not changing the story, but the story that we're choosing to tell about another person. Yes, they might be acting this way or doing this thing, but do you want to identify them as that? Right? Do we want to put them in this box, essentially deeming them as a bad person, a manipulative person? It's really hard, I find, to authentically judge another and get to that place of absolute certainty. They are bad, they are this. And yes, there is evil in the world, and I am not naive to that. And I think there's value in actually being able to identify it and call it out, sort of speak the truth for what it is, right? But that's a different topic. And I think most of our relationships are not that. And most experiences in our life truly are a matter of us needing to take responsibility for our own perceptions. But let me just say one more thing on this. This never means lacking healthy boundaries. We have Pluto in Capricorn, Mars in Cancer. This is all about boundaries. Mostly boundaries are for us. We determine what our boundaries are, and we let others know that simply by the way that we're choosing to respect ourselves. I think a big part of our empowerment is really recognizing, oh, I have a place, I have work to do, I need to take care of my soul, take care of my soul purpose. Our boundaries and our purpose and our alignment with our soul is for us to cultivate and tend to. And then, I find the world does what it does. People act the way they act. And there's only so much that we can do to push up against or fight up against or wage war against what we can't control. But there's an immense amount of healing coming back to what is my purpose. And I do find there's a natural diminishing of concern of what I might gain or what I might lose when I know that I am who I'm supposed to be. When I know that I'm back on track, that I'm doing my work, I'm holding myself and choosing to be the person that I want to be, I'm less prone to victimization and concern with outcome. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about that. The last point that I would want to make is just contemplate where is the placement of your Mars, of your Moon and your Saturn, right? Moon rules Cancer, Saturn rules Capricorn. So in your own natal chart, this transit's actually instigating this. And that's going to speak a lot to how we're going to be internalizing and meeting this on a basic level. Let's say you have a Moon in Taurus. Okay, so there's a lot of emotional trigger and confrontation and stress, and you're being pushed to grow. But the issue with a Taurus Moon is a Taurus Moon might resort towards avoiding confrontation or conflict, numb out, and move in the direction of what feels safe and secure and thus resist growth. Versus, let's say you have a Scorpio moon. Scorpio moon might get further enmeshed in the conflict, in the entanglement, and become very emotionally identified with the things that are happening and kind of lose themselves in that. So you kind of work with the moon in terms of, what is the way in which we're learning to embody that self-leadership and emotionally integrate all the content that's arising. And relative to Saturn, fundamentally, Saturn, ruler of Capricorn, at Pluto at the end of Capricorn, there's so much right here with your natal Saturn position in terms of where you're learning those boundaries, where you're learning to claim the strength and the clarity and the agency of where you're cultivating your terrain long term, the discipline and the commitment to building the life that you want to build. Contemplating that in your natal chart is really helpful because that's a way to come back to yourself. That's a way to come back to, I got to do what I got to do. I can't control what's happening on the outside. There's only so much that we can control in terms of people, places, and experiences. But we have an immense amount of free will and agency in terms of how we're choosing to structure our energy and our time in this life. Of course, you can work with the moon and the Saturn together, see their phase. So this is, of course, a dimension that takes a little more astrological skill, but meditate on it, right? I think a lot of what we can learn here can just be through a sort of intuitive contemplation of these archetypes. Okay, so that is it for this video. I'm going to, again, make a video highlighting this transit through the houses. I look very forward to that. As always, thank you for watching.